Long before satellites scanned the planet from orbit, and long before humanity learned to model catastrophe with equations and simulations, there was a moment when the ground itself became uninhabitable in a single morning. Entire cities vanished not over generations, not through conquest or decline, but instantly, leaving behind land so altered that nothing would grow there again. Ancient witnesses did not describe chaos, they described precision. Fire did not wander, it arrived where it was meant to arrive. And afterward the land did not heal, it rejected life, as if something fundamental had been rewritten. Why would destruction leave behind such permanent consequences? Why were survivors warned not to look back, not out of grief, but out of danger? Why does the aftermath described in ancient texts resemble effects humanity only learned to recognize in the modern age? And why do these accounts appear in multiple cultures, separated by distance, language, and belief, yet aligned in detail? Before we go further, take a moment and tap the like button if you enjoy these long-form, deeply researched stories. It helps more than you realise. And if you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is there. Night shift, early morning, somewhere far away. I read every message. As always, you don't need visuals for this. Everything important is carried in the story itself. The valley that would later become synonymous with death was not always lifeless. Ancient descriptions are remarkably consistent on this point. Before its destruction, it was a place of abundance. Water flowed through it in braided streams. Crops grew reliably. Trade routes passed through its lowlands, connecting distant regions. In an arid world, such corridors were power. Whoever controlled them controlled food, movement, and survival. This was not a marginal place. It was strategic. Texts describe it as carefully cultivated, not wild. Irrigation channels, managed fields, and structured settlements point to deliberate human planning. These were not primitive villages clinging to survival. They were organised urban centres integrated into wider economic networks. Their prosperity did not come from isolation, but from connection. And then, abruptly, those connections ended. What remains striking is not simply that these cities were destroyed, but that they were never rebuilt. In the ancient world, ruins were rarely abandoned forever. Stones were reused, foundations were reclaimed, memory faded and life returned. Yet here, the land itself became an obstacle. Generations passed without resettlement. Farmers avoided it instinctively. The soil resisted cultivation, as though it carried something invisible but persistent. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Ancient writers did not describe the destruction as gradual or chaotic. They did not speak of invading armies or drawn-out sieges. They described a sudden event, overwhelmingly powerful, arriving from above. Fire and sulphur fell together. Not scattered lightning, not ordinary flame. Something sustained, something concentrated. Sulphur, known in antiquity as brimstone, was not a poetic choice. It burns hotter than wood, releases toxic fumes, and leaves behind residue that poisons soil. Ancient people understood its effects intimately. It was used sparingly, often in rituals meant to cleanse by erasing life completely. Combined with fire, it does not simply destroy structures, it sterilizes land. The texts emphasize totality. Buildings, inhabitants, vegetation, gone together. This is not conquest. Conquest leaves survivors, spoils, and reconstruction. This is eradication. From a distant vantage point, a witness describes smoke rising like that of a furnace. The comparison is precise. A furnace does not flicker. It roars upward, pulling air into itself, creating a vertical column that reshapes the sky. Anyone who has seen industrial combustion recognizes this. Image instinctively. It is not poetic exaggeration, it is observation. What follows is perhaps the most telling detail. Survivors are warned not to linger in the lowlands. They are told to flee to higher ground immediately. The danger is not described as moral, it is described as environmental. The land itself has become hostile. And then there is the warning not to look back. This detail has often been interpreted symbolically as an emotional or moral failing. But the language used does not suggest nostalgia or regret. It suggests exposure. Looking back is dangerous not because of sentiment, but because of proximity, because something remains in the air. The fate of the woman who does look back is preserved with disturbing specificity. She does not burn. She does not collapse. She becomes something else, a standing remnant, salt. In this region, salt is not metaphorical. Excess salinity kills soil. Fields oversaturated with it turn white, hard and sterile. Nothing grows. To become salt is to become exclusion from life itself. Whether the account describes mineral encrustation, chemical exposure, or symbolic memory, the effect is the same. The boundary was crossed too late. For centuries, these details were treated as theological metaphor, moral warning, divine judgment. But theology alone cannot explain why the land never recovered. Archaeological surveys reveal long gaps in habitation. Not decades, centuries. Ancient farmers were practical. They did not abandon fertile land unless it ceased to be fertile. Modern science offers new language, but the same pattern. Sudden extreme heat, a shock powerful enough to flatten structures. Lingering contamination that renders soil unusable. Warnings about distance, direction, and exposure. These are not moral categories. They are physical ones. What unsettles scholars is not that ancient people described destruction, but that they described it accurately without understanding its mechanism. They preserved effects, not explanations. And when technology finally provided comparable events, the descriptions aligned uncomfortably well. This does not mean ancient writers understood physics. It means they witnessed consequences, and consequences leave fingerprints. What makes this event especially troubling is what happens afterward in the narrative. There is no rebuilding, no cleansing, no return. Attention shifts elsewhere, as if the land itself has been written off. In historical records, such silence often marks places where something went so catastrophically wrong that no one wanted to preserve details, only warnings. The valley becomes a scar embedded in geography. Water grows bitter. Soil turns hostile. The place becomes the lowest exposed point on land, pulled downward by unseen forces. Even standing there today, observers report an oppressive stillness. Heat presses downward. Sound carries differently. The landscape feels wrong, not mythically, but physically. Yet this is only one half of the story, because far to the east, another civilization preserved memories of destruction that do not focus on moral failure, but on decision-making, on debates, on authority, on power used deliberately, not impulsively. They wrote on clay, not parchment. Clay survives fire. And what they recorded suggests that events like this were not accidents of nature, but outcomes of conflict, not between humans, but between those who claimed authority over them. And if that is true, then the destruction of these cities was not a random act of wrath. It was a maneuver, and the land paid the price. The Eastern records do not begin with myth or poetry. They begin with administration. On clay tablets, baked hard by fire and time, scribes recorded disputes, decisions, allocations of labour, and enforcement of authority. These were not storytellers preserving legend. They were accountants of power, and embedded within their meticulous lists and formal language is something far more disturbing than fantasy. They describe beings who argued over control, who issued decrees, who punished defiance, and who wielded forces that reshaped land itself. In these records, destruction is not framed as moral correction. It is framed as enforcement. The civilization that preserved these tablets did not believe humanity discovered civilization on its own. It believed civilization arrived. Their earliest kings did not claim invention. They claimed appointment. Authority was something bestowed, monitored, and revoked. Power did not emerge from below. It descended. The terms used are often softened in translation, but the original language is blunt. Those who came were not distant abstractions. They measured land. They assigned roles. They imposed order. They argued among themselves, and when order was threatened, they responded with overwhelming force. What is chilling is how procedural it all sounds. There is no sense of rage in these accounts. No chaos. Decisions are discussed. Councils convened. Outcomes weighed. When punishment is decided, it is carried out efficiently. The goal is not spectacle, it is compliance. This reframes everything. If the destruction of the valley was not an isolated act of divine anger, but part of a broader system of control, then the warnings make sense. Evacuation was not mercy, it was asset retrieval. Distance was not obedience, it was survival protocol. Even the timing matters. The destruction occurs at dawn. Not midnight, not randomly. Dawn offers visibility, atmospheric stability, predictable wind patterns. Anyone familiar with high-energy events understands the importance of timing. Ancient writers did not know why dawn mattered. They only recorded that it did. And then there is the wind. In both Western and Eastern traditions, destruction is followed by something worse than fire. A wind described as evil, not because it is supernatural, but because it carries death invisibly. People fall ill, crops fail, animals die without wounds. Survivors flee not from ruins, but from air itself. Modern language would call this fallout. Ancient language had no such term. Instead, it spoke of breath that kills, of air that corrupts, of land that rejects life. What follows in the Eastern records is just as telling as what precedes the destruction. The gods themselves retreat. They flee cities. They abandon temples. They speak of fear, not of enemies, but of consequences. They describe being unable to remain where the wind has passed. This detail should stop you. Deities who command storms do not flee weather. Authorities who control fire do not fear heat, unless what was unleashed exceeded their control. The records describe sealed spaces, deep chambers, protected zones. The language resembles containment, not sanctuary. Something has gone wrong. Something has spread beyond the target area. And suddenly, power shifts. Cities that once dominated fall silent. Agricultural systems collapse. Populations disperse. Authority fractures. The centre of civilization moves northward, away from the affected zones. This is not mythology. It is visible in the archaeological record. Urban decline follows the same pattern described in the texts. Then quietly, a new power rises, not through destruction, through survival. A city positioned just beyond the reach of the poisoned wind remains intact. Its fields grow, its temples function. Refugees arrive carrying skills, knowledge, and memory. This city does not seize power by force. It inherits it by geography, and it rewrites the story. In the new narrative, destruction becomes justice. Authority becomes righteousness. Centralized control becomes necessary for order. The lesson is reframed carefully. Fragmentation invites chaos, and chaos invites annihilation. This reframing is brilliant. It turns catastrophe into justification, and it ensures that future generations will fear disorder more than domination. What disappears in this retelling are the mechanics, the warnings, the protocols, the fact that destruction was chosen, not inevitable. Theology absorbs technology. Symbol replaces process. Memory becomes doctrine. But the land does not accept reinterpretation. The poisoned zones remain poisoned. The abandoned cities remain empty. Centuries pass without recovery. Salt continues to surface. Glassy fragments persist in soil. These are not moral residues, they are physical ones. And now, thousands of years later, science stumbles into the same conclusions by accident. Excavations uncover destruction layers too hot for ancient kilns, pottery surfaces melted from the outside in, walls flattened outward as if struck by immense pressure, tiny metallic spheres formed by vaporized material cooling mid-air, shocked quartz that only forms under instantaneous extreme stress. No siege does this, no earthquake does this, no ordinary fire does this. Yet the ancient accounts describe exactly these effects without understanding their cause, which raises the most uncomfortable question so far. If ancient observers recorded the effects of an event we would now classify as a high-energy detonation, something capable of sterilizing land and collapsing cities in an instant, then the real mystery is not whether it happened. The mystery is who decided it should happen and why. Because once you accept that destruction on this scale occurred and that it followed decision-making rather than chance, the story is no longer about divine judgment or moral allegory. It becomes a case study in power. Who holds it? How it is used? And what happens when restraint fails? The valley was not cursed. It was rewritten. And what happened there did not end with smoke rising like a furnace. It changed how power would be exercised forever after. Because once such force is used, it cannot be forgotten. It can only be buried. And buried things have a way of resurfacing when conditions repeat. What follows the burial of such force is never silence. It is adjustment. Civilizations do not simply absorb an event that erases cities and poisons land. They reorganize around it, often without realizing they are doing so. Power learns new rules. Memory becomes selective. Certain questions stop being asked, not because answers are forbidden, but because asking them threatens stability. After the destruction, authority everywhere grows more cautious in appearance and more absolute in structure. Direct intervention fades. Presence becomes symbolic. Power retreats behind law, ritual, and distance. No more walking openly among cities. No more sudden acts that reveal the mechanics behind the curtain. The lesson has been learned too well. When power shows itself too clearly, it destabilizes everything beneath it. So instead, power becomes invisible. Commands arrive through intermediaries. Orders are framed as law. Law is framed as destiny. Destiny is framed as sacred. The chain is elegant and safe. No one sees the hand anymore, only the result. This is when boundaries harden. Certain lands become forbidden. Certain mountains are marked as untouchable. Certain zones are surrounded by rules that feel religious, but function practically. Do not enter. Do not remain. Do not approach. These are not mystical taboos. They are hazard warnings translated into culture. Over time, the reason disappears, the warning remains. The Sinai region becomes one of these places. Descriptions of it are strikingly consistent across traditions that otherwise disagree on almost everything. Fire, smoke, trembling ground, a voice too overwhelming to endure, strict distance enforced with death as consequence, no images allowed, no casual approach, only designated intermediaries may enter, and only briefly. This is not the language of worship, it is the language of containment. The people are told not to touch, not to ascend, not to linger. Even animals crossing the boundary are destroyed. Why such severity? Because contamination does not care about intent. Exposure is exposure. Later generations will interpret this as holiness. But holiness here behaves exactly like danger. And the one who enters this space does not remain. There is no settlement, no capital, no city built atop the mountain. The encounter is temporary, controlled, and followed by withdrawal. The power does not stay, because staying would repeat the mistake. Elsewhere, a different solution emerges. Instead of restricting access to places, access to knowledge is restricted. Information becomes layered. Initiation replaces discovery. Wisdom is dispensed slowly, bound to loyalty and discipline. Secrets are not hidden because they are false, but because they are potent. This is where priesthoods, mystery schools, and guarded traditions appear. They are not relics of superstition. They are containment systems. Knowledge without restraint had already destroyed cities once. That lesson is not forgotten quickly, but it is not remembered accurately either, over generations. The story simplifies. Fire becomes punishment. Wind becomes curse. Salt becomes moral residue. The mechanics vanish. The behaviour remains. People learn to fear certain outcomes without understanding causes. This fear becomes morality. Obedience replaces comprehension. It is safer that way. What is extraordinary is how consistent this pattern is across cultures that never contacted one another. Everywhere, early civilizations show the same traits after sudden collapses: withdrawal of overt power, emphasis on law over force, fear of uncontrolled fire and light, sacred boundaries around dangerous zones, suspicion of excessive knowledge, myths warning against overreach. This is not coincidence. It is systemic trauma. Civilization behaves like an organism that has survived near fatal injury. It changes habits. It limits exposure. It becomes conservative, not ideologically, but structurally. And this conservatism works. For thousands of years, humanity advances slowly but steadily. Cities rise again, but rarely in the same places. Technology improves, but within bounds. No force comparable to the ancient destruction is ever used again, at least not openly. The memory holds, until it begins to fade, because memory always fades when consequences are delayed long enough. As generations pass without recurrence, caution feels unnecessary. Boundaries feel arbitrary. Restrictions feel oppressive. What once protected survival now appears to limit progress. This is where reinterpretation begins. The ancient catastrophe is no longer read as warning. It is read as allegory. Fire becomes metaphor. Judgment becomes theology. The physical reality of poisoned land is treated as coincidence, and slowly, confidence returns. Humanity begins to believe that whatever destroyed the old cities belonged to a world of ignorance, that modern minds, armed with reason and calculation, could never repeat such mistakes. This belief is the true inheritance of the catastrophe, not fear, confidence, because fear restrains, confidence experiments, and experiments escalate. But before we go any further, pause here for a moment. If you're still listening, tell me where you are right now and what time it is where you're hearing this. These stories travel across centuries and continents, and it's always grounding to remember the living minds carrying them forward tonight. And if this narrative resonates with you, if it feels like it's connecting dots that history usually keeps separate, consider staying with us. A like or a subscription helps this kind of long-form storytelling survive in a world that prefers answers over questions. Now let's continue, because the next shift is the most dangerous one of all. It is the moment when restraint becomes optional, when the old warnings are still visible, but no longer believed, when humanity does not forget the fire, but decides it understands it. And that decision has always been the beginning of the next collapse. Understanding is a seductive thing. It convinces those who hold it that they are immune to the mistakes of the past, not because the past was wrong, but because it was incomplete. This is how restraint erodes without anyone consciously choosing recklessness. The danger no longer feels external, it feels manageable. After enough time has passed, the ancient catastrophe is no longer treated as an event. It becomes a reference point, a symbol. Something scholars debate, priests moralise, and poets reshape. The land still carries scars, but scars can be reinterpreted. Salt becomes curse, ruins become romance, silence becomes mystery, and mystery invites curiosity. This is the moment when humanity begins to look backward, not with fear, but with fascination. What did they know? What did they build? What did they touch that we have forgotten? These questions mark a turning point. They are not dangerous on their own. Curiosity is not the enemy. The danger lies in the assumption beneath them, the belief that knowledge can be recovered without consequence. This belief emerges quietly. It does not announce itself as arrogance. It arrives dressed as scholarship, as exploration, as reverence for the past. Ancient texts are translated, ruins are excavated, symbols are decoded. What was once taboo becomes academic. Fire is no longer feared, it is studied. Light is no longer avoided, it is measured. Power is no longer hidden, it is catalogued. At first, this seems harmless. Nothing catastrophic happens immediately. In fact, progress accelerates. New techniques appear. Engineering improves. Calendars become precise. Navigation expands. Humanity feels clever, capable, and safe. This is the most dangerous phase of all, because catastrophe does not return immediately. It waits. The ancient destruction did not happen because knowledge existed. It happened because knowledge was applied at scale without restraint. The same pattern unfolds again here, but slower, quieter, disguised as improvement. Civilizations begin to centralize again. Authority consolidates, not always politically, but technologically and informationally. Certain groups gain access to specialized knowledge, others do not. Control shifts subtly from land to systems. Whoever manages infrastructure manages survival. This is where hierarchy returns, not the divine hierarchy of gods, but the structural hierarchy of expertise. And once again, power separates from consequence. Those who design systems are insulated from their failures. Those who benefit most are least exposed to risk. This separation is what allows escalation to continue unchecked. Ancient stories warned against this separation explicitly. Gods who lived above the consequences made decisions that devastated those below. That memory was preserved for a reason. But memory without mechanism becomes myth, and myth loses authority over behaviour. So humanity builds again. Bigger cities, more complex networks, tighter dependencies. Every improvement reduces margin for error. Every efficiency removes redundancy. Every optimization trades resilience for speed. From the inside, this feels like mastery. From the outside, from the perspective of history, it looks identical to previous pre-collapse phases. The signs are subtle at first. Systems become brittle. Small disruptions cascade unexpectedly. Local failures ripple outward. Recovery takes longer each time. But because collapse does not arrive all at once, it is rationalized away. Analysts produce models. Leaders issue assurances. Adjustments are made at the edges. No one wants to say the word collapse, because collapse implies inevitability, and inevitability threatens the belief in control. This belief is the final inheritance of the ancient catastrophe. The conviction that this time is different, that belief existed then too. Those who unleashed overwhelming force believed they were restoring order permanently. They believed the destruction would solve the problem. Instead, it created conditions that no one could fully control, not even those who initiated it. The land paid the price first, then civilization, then memory, and finally confidence. Now pause again and consider this. Every civilization that collapsed believed it was correcting instability, not creating it. Every one of them believed their knowledge was sufficient. Every one of them acted decisively when restraint felt too slow. The pattern is not ignorance, it is certainty. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable truth hidden inside all ancient warnings. The catastrophe was not caused by evil, it was caused by conviction. The conviction that the problem was understood. The conviction that consequences were acceptable. The conviction that power could be contained once released. This is why the ancient world encoded its lesson so strangely, not as technical instruction, not as historical report, but as taboo. Do not touch, do not enter, do not look back. Because once you believe you understand, curiosity overcomes fear, and once fear disappears, restraint collapses. The modern world stands exactly at that threshold. It knows the stories, it sees the ruins, it understands the mechanisms well enough to recreate them. What it lacks is not intelligence, it lacks humility. And humility is the only thing that ever prevented repetition. As we move forward, the question is no longer what destroyed the ancient cities. The evidence already answers that. The question now is whether humanity recognizes the pattern before it completes another cycle. Because cycles do not announce themselves as destiny, they announce themselves as progress, and they only reveal their true shape when it is too late to stop them. There is a reason ancient civilizations did not preserve technical manuals describing their greatest powers. It was not because they lacked intelligence. It was because they understood something modern societies struggle to accept, that once certain knowledge is widely accessible, control over its use evaporates. Knowledge does not stay contextual. It spreads. It detaches from wisdom. It outpaces restraint. This is why the most dangerous knowledge in antiquity was not written plainly. It was wrapped in ritual, buried in metaphor, guarded by initiations that tested temperament, patience, and loyalty before revelation. Power was not hidden to protect elites, it was hidden to protect the world. But time erodes gatekeeping. Ritual becomes ceremony. Ceremony becomes tradition. Tradition becomes symbolism. Symbolism becomes curiosity. And curiosity, once freed from fear, becomes ambition. This erosion happened slowly, quietly, and repeatedly. Long after the ancient catastrophe, the civilizations that followed began to believe that the danger had been misunderstood, that the old stories exaggerated, that the warnings were moral theatre rather than records of consequence. The land was scarred, yes, but surely that was coincidence. Surely it was superstition layered over natural disaster. And so exploration resumed. People returned to forbidden valleys. They rebuilt near unstable waters. They mined regions once avoided. Each success reinforced the idea that the past had been wrong, that the fear was outdated, that humanity had matured. This belief did not arise from malice. It arose from normalcy. Nothing catastrophic happened immediately. The world did not end when boundaries were crossed. And because catastrophe did not arrive on schedule, confidence grew. This is how thresholds are crossed, incrementally, without ceremony. Civilizations do not wake up one morning and decide to repeat the past. They drift toward repetition because the early steps appear harmless, even beneficial. So the first steps are always rewarded. More food, more energy, more connectivity, more efficiency. And then, gradually, dependency replaces choice. Systems become too large to fail without causing harm. Stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. At this stage, restraint feels irresponsible. This is the trap every advanced civilization falls into. Ancient or modern, the psychology is the same. When progress becomes infrastructure, it can no longer be questioned without threatening survival itself. Power ceases to be optional, it becomes necessary. and necessity is the most persuasive justification of all. The ancient catastrophe occurred precisely at this point. The force that erased cities was not unleashed casually. It was deployed because leadership believed the alternative was worse. Disorder felt existential, control felt urgent, delay felt dangerous, and so decisive action was taken. What followed proved that the calculus was flawed, not because the intention was wrong, but because the scale was misjudged. The problem was not that power was used. The problem was that once used, it could not be recalled. The aftermath did not care about intent. It obeyed physics. Heat spread, pressure, propagated. Chemistry altered soil. Time did not heal what had been changed at the atomic level. The land did not forgive, and neither did history. This is the detail that ancient stories preserved most faithfully, not the spectacle of destruction, but the permanence of consequence. Cities could be rebuilt elsewhere, but the destroyed region remained unusable. Generations passed. The silence remained. Modern civilization now stands in a moment eerily similar. Capabilities exist that can reshape systems irreversibly. They are justified as deterrents, safeguards, or necessities. They are framed as tools of stability. They are managed by experts. They are insulated from public accountability. And they are treated as inevitable. This is not conspiracy, it is structural repetition. Every advanced civilization develops tools whose consequences exceed governance capacity. The difference between survival and collapse lies in whether those tools remain unused. The ancient world failed that test once. It learned afterward. The modern world has not yet been tested in the same way. That does not mean safety, it means suspense. Because the conditions are familiar: consolidated power, complex systems, compressed timelines, delayed feedback, confidence in control, and a growing distance between those who decide and those who endure. History shows that collapse does not require villainy. It requires misalignment between scale and restraint. And restraint cannot be retrofitted once momentum takes over. This is why ancient warnings were absolute. Do not touch. Do not enter. Do not look back. Not because curiosity was sinful, but because some thresholds do not allow return. Once crossed, consequences propagate faster than correction. This is the lesson written into dead land. This is why the ancient catastrophe remains relevant, not as prophecy, but as precedent. And this is why the most important question is not what destroyed the past. It is whether the present recognizes itself in the pattern. Because history does not punish. It does not judge. It only repeats structures when conditions align. And right now, they are aligning. The most unsettling aspect of repeating patterns is not that they exist, but that they feel invisible while you're inside them. From within a system, momentum feels like progress, expansion feels like security, complexity feels like sophistication, and restraint feels like fear dressed up as wisdom. This is why civilizations rarely recognize danger while advancing toward it. The signs are not dramatic. They are administrative, technical, boring. Warnings arrive as reports, not prophecies. Concerns are raised in committees, not in fire. The world does not shake until it is already too late. In the ancient catastrophe, the moment of realization came after the decision, not before. Those who authorized the release of overwhelming force believed they were restoring order. They believed they were ending a crisis decisively. They did not anticipate that the aftermath would outlast the conflict itself. After the fire fell, there was no enemy left to negotiate with. Only land that would not heal. Only air that made breathing dangerous. Only silence where governance had once mattered. This is the part modern culture struggles to internalize. Consequences do not remain proportional. They compound. They migrate. They persist long after intentions have faded. The ancient texts preserved this reality carefully, not through equations or diagrams, but through insistence, the insistence that nothing grew there again, the insistence that the land was cursed, the insistence that survivors never returned. Those were not theological claims. They were environmental observations. The writers were saying, in the language available to them, this place is broken, not symbolically, functionally. And broken systems do not respond to moral correction. They respond only to time, chemistry, and entropy, sometimes not even then. When modern archaeology uncovered vitrified stone, shocked quartz, and spherules embedded in destruction layers, it did not invalidate ancient accounts. It validated their restraint. The writers did not exaggerate. If anything, they underdescribed what happened. They described what could be safely remembered, because remembering too precisely would invite repetition. This selective preservation of memory shaped everything that followed. Civilizations after the catastrophe grew wary of singular solutions. They distrusted total answers. They learned to favour redundancy over efficiency, tradition over novelty, balance over dominance. These were not philosophical choices. They were survival adaptations. Over time, as generations passed without witnessing similar devastation, these adaptations began to feel unnecessary. Redundancy looked inefficient. Tradition looked stagnant. Balance looked like hesitation. And so each subsequent civilization loosened the constraints slightly, not all at once, just enough to grow faster, just enough to outpace memory. This is how danger returns, not as repetition of event, but as repetition of conditions. Modern civilization has surpassed ancient societies, not in wisdom, but in reach. The scale is planetary. The speed is instantaneous. Feedback loops operate faster than reflection. Decisions cascade across systems too complex to reverse cleanly. And yet, the belief persists that control scales alongside capability, that because systems are designed, they are governable, that because models exist, outcomes are predictable, that because safeguards exist, failure will be contained. The ancient catastrophe proves otherwise. Complex systems do not fail where safeguards are strongest. They fail at the margins, where interactions are unanticipated, where assumptions overlap, where small errors amplify. The ancient world did not understand this formally, but it learned it viscerally. After the destruction, survivors reorganized around one core principle: never again allow a single action to determine everything. Decentralization increased, authority fragmented, sacred power was distributed. This was not idealism, it was insurance. Modern systems have reversed this logic. Efficiency favours centralization, optimization favours uniformity, control favours consolidation. These tendencies are rewarded economically and politically. Restraint is punished. The result is a system that appears strong but lacks elasticity, and elasticity is what determines survival under stress. The ancient catastrophe was a stress test that civilization failed. The survivors rebuilt to avoid failing again. The modern world has not yet faced a comparable test. That does not mean it will not. It means the outcome is undecided, because history does not operate on morality. It operates on thresholds, and thresholds do not announce themselves. They are crossed quietly, incrementally, until the system behaves differently all at once. The ancient fire was not inevitable. It was triggered by choice, under pressure, with incomplete understanding. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Civilizations do not collapse because they lack warnings. They collapse because warnings conflict with incentives, and incentives always feel more urgent than memory. This is why ancient societies encoded fear into myth instead of instruction. Fear survives longer than explanation. Fear persists when logic erodes. Modern societies pride themselves on rationality. But rationality without humility is not protection. It is acceleration. The ancient catastrophe remains the clearest example humanity has of what happens when power outruns wisdom, not because the ancients were foolish, but because they were human. The question now is not whether humanity will repeat the past exactly. It never does. The question is whether it will repeat the structure. And from where we stand, the resemblance is uncomfortably precise. What history rarely admits is that collapse does not feel like collapse while it is happening. It feels like adjustment. It feels like transition. It feels like temporary instability on the way to something better. That illusion is one of the most reliable features of every failed system. In the ancient world, the final days before annihilation were not marked by panic in the streets or prophets screaming on every corner. They were marked by routine. Trade continued, councils met. Decisions were justified with confidence. The extraordinary response was framed as necessary precisely because everything else felt so ordinary. The same pattern appears again and again in the archaeological record. Destruction layers sit directly atop layers of normal life. Cooking vessels shattered mid-use. Tools left where hands dropped them. Homes abandoned without preparation. These are not signs of slow decline. They are signatures of sudden transition, moments when normalcy persisted until it didn't. This is why the ancient catastrophe carries such weight as a warning. It reveals that the most dangerous phase of any civilization is not decay. It is peak confidence. Peak confidence convinces societies that they can manage consequences faster than consequences can unfold. It breeds faith in intervention rather than prevention. It rewards boldness over restraint. And it blinds decision makers to the one factor they cannot model: cascading failure. The ancient fire did not destroy only its target. It altered wind patterns. It salted soil. It poisoned water. It destabilized neighboring systems that had nothing to do with the original conflict. The result was not victory. It was systemic collapse. Modern systems are far more interconnected than ancient ones ever were. Supply chains span continents. Energy grids cross borders. Digital networks synchronize behavior at global scale. These systems produce efficiency, but they also transmit failure instantly. A localized shock no longer stays local. This is not speculation. It is structural reality. When ancient societies rebuilt after catastrophe, they intuitively limited interdependence. Regions became more self-sufficient. Trade slowed. Redundancy increased. Diversity of practice replaced standardization. These changes were not ideological, they were adaptive. Modern civilization has moved in the opposite direction, deliberately. Interdependence is treated as strength. Standardization is treated as progress. Redundancy is treated as waste. Each of these choices improves performance under normal conditions. Each of them worsens survivability under stress. This trade-off is rarely discussed honestly because it forces an uncomfortable admission. Maximum efficiency and maximum resilience cannot coexist. The ancient world learned this through loss. The modern world has yet to internalize it. That gap between capability and restraint is where risk accumulates. And risk, unlike danger, does not feel urgent until it becomes irreversible. Ancient cultures encoded this understanding into taboo. Certain actions were simply forbidden, not debated, not optimized, forbidden. Sacred boundaries existed not to assert authority, but to prevent escalation. When those boundaries were crossed, consequences followed swiftly and permanently. Over time, as memory faded, those taboos lost their grounding. They became rituals without context, laws without explanation, prohibitions that invited challenge. Modern culture excels at challenging boundaries. It does not ask why a limit exists. It asks whether the limit can be bypassed. And if it can, it usually is. This mentality has produced astonishing achievements. It has also recreated the preconditions for catastrophe. The ancient catastrophe teaches that once certain thresholds are crossed, recovery is no longer an option, only adaptation to loss. The poisoned land did not regenerate because people wished it to. The cities did not reappear because survivors mourned them. They were gone, permanently. Modern civilization struggles to accept permanence of loss. It believes in reversibility, in fixes, in solutions, in second chances. History does not support this belief. Some losses close doors forever. The ancient survivors understood this because they lived in a world with fewer illusions. Their tools were limited. Their environment responded visibly to damage. When land failed, it failed unmistakably. Modern damage is often delayed, abstracted, or displaced. The effects accumulate invisibly, until they don't. The final warning of the ancient catastrophe is not about fire or gods or punishment. It is about scale. When actions operate at scales beyond comprehension, intention becomes irrelevant. The system responds according to physics, chemistry, and biology, not ethics. No amount of belief changes that. Civilizations that survive long term learn to operate below those thresholds. They learn to leave some capacities unused. They learn to prioritize continuity over dominance. They learn that wisdom is not the accumulation of power, but the discipline to refuse its most dangerous applications. Whether modern civilization will relearn this lesson voluntarily remains unknown. But history makes one thing very clear. The past does not need to repeat itself exactly to assert its authority. It only needs conditions that rhyme. And from here, the rhyme is unmistakable. The most unsettling aspect of the ancient catastrophe is not that it happened. It is that no one involved believed they were doing something unprecedented. Every decision made in its final hours was justified as reasonable, necessary, even responsible. Authority was exercised with confidence. Risk was acknowledged, then dismissed. Alternatives were considered too slow, too uncertain, too disruptive. In other words, collapse arrived wearing the mask of competence. This is why the past feels uncomfortably familiar when examined closely, not because history repeats mechanically, but because human reasoning under pressure remains remarkably consistent. When systems grow complex, leaders stop asking whether something should be done and focus instead on whether it can be done efficiently. Capability replaces judgment, and capability, once normalized, demands expression. In the ancient world, the threshold was crossed when overwhelming force was viewed as the cleanest solution to instability. The justification was order. The result was irreversibility. What followed was not chaos in the dramatic sense, but quiet erasure. Fields stopped producing, trade routes dissolved, populations migrated without understanding why. Entire regions fell silent, not from ongoing violence, but from the absence of viability. Silence is the true marker of collapse. Noise belongs to crisis. Silence belongs to aftermath. Modern civilization rarely imagines silence as danger. It fears disruption, volatility, unrest. It prepares endlessly for turbulence while ignoring the possibility of emptiness. The ancient catastrophe did not produce endless war. It produced absence. No cities to fight over. No surplus to contest. No system left to repair. This distinction matters because modern systems are optimized to manage disruption, not disappearance. Emergency responses, recovery plans, and resilience frameworks assume continuity of core structures. They are ineffective against permanent loss. The ancient survivors adapted because they had no alternative. Their world had shrunk. They learned to live within narrower margins. Their descendants inherited that narrowness as culture, law, and taboo. Over centuries, that inheritance softened into ritual and belief. Eventually, belief detached from consequence. The modern world stands at that same point of detachment. Warnings exist, but they are abstract. Consequences are projected into the future, dispersed across populations, diluted by uncertainty. The ancient world had no such buffer. Its lesson was immediate and brutal. That lesson can be summarized simply. Not everything that is technically possible is survivable. This principle contradicts the dominant narrative of progress. Progress assumes that capability implies legitimacy. That advancement is inherently beneficial. That scale equals success. The ancient catastrophe disproves this assumption decisively. It shows that some advancements reduce future possibility rather than expand it, that some victories cost more than they gain, that some solutions solve one problem by creating a larger one. The aftermath reveals another critical insight. Collapse does not erase intelligence. It erases infrastructure. The survivors of the ancient catastrophe were not less capable than their predecessors. They were more constrained. They possessed knowledge but lacked systems to support its expression. This inversion is essential. Civilization depends less on intelligence than on continuity of support structures. Once those structures are gone, knowledge becomes inert. This is why the ancient world rebuilt slowly, not because people forgot how to build, but because the networks required to sustain complexity had been destroyed. Modern civilization is built atop networks even more fragile. Energy, logistics, information, governance, finance, all interlocked tightly enough that failure in one cascades rapidly into others. The ancient catastrophe fractured a region. A modern equivalent would fracture the planet. This is not alarmism, it is proportional reasoning. The scale of consequence tracks the scale of interdependence, and interdependence has never been higher. Despite this, confidence persists. The belief that systems can be restarted, that damage can be undone, that collapse is reversible. History offers no support for this belief. Recovery, when it occurs, is partial and selective. What returns is not what was lost, but something smaller, adapted, constrained. The ancient survivors did not restore their world. They inherited a different one. The modern world has not yet confronted that possibility honestly. It imagines recovery as restoration rather than adaptation. This misalignment increases risk. When planning assumes restoration, systems are built to snap back rather than transform. When transformation becomes necessary, they fail instead. The ancient catastrophe forced transformation. The modern world still believes restoration is possible. That belief delays necessary adjustment. It keeps civilization operating near thresholds it no longer fully understands. Another lesson emerges when examining who survived. Survival did not correlate with moral superiority, intelligence, or power. It correlated with position. Distance mattered. Direction mattered. Timing mattered. Those far enough away lived. Those who left early lived. Those who stayed, regardless of virtue, died. This undermines comforting narratives about justice and control. Catastrophe is indifferent. It does not reward intention. It enforces physics, modern. Systems often assume that preparedness guarantees survival, that resources, planning, and expertise confer immunity. The ancient catastrophe contradicts this assumption. Prepared cities were erased. Unprepared wanderers survived. The variable was exposure. This insight reframes modern risk. Safety is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about avoidance, distance, refusal, choosing not to be present where danger concentrates. Ancient cultures internalized this lesson deeply. They avoided certain places. They limited growth in vulnerable zones. They respected boundaries drawn by geography and memory. Modern civilization erases boundaries in pursuit of efficiency. It builds everywhere. It connects everything. It assumes control can replace avoidance. This assumption is fragile. When avoidance is impossible, consequences become universal. The ancient catastrophe preserved one final warning through silence. Places that should have been rebuilt were not. That choice persisted for centuries, not because people forgot how, but because memory told them not to try. That restraint did more to preserve humanity than any technological advancement. It prevented repetition. The question now is whether restraint can re-emerge without devastation as its teacher, because restraint learned voluntarily is wisdom. Restraint imposed by collapse is aftermath. History suggests that civilizations rarely choose the former until the latter removes alternatives. The ancient catastrophe stands as evidence not of inevitability, but of consequence. It shows what happens when thresholds are crossed in confidence. It shows that collapse does not announce itself as failure. It arrives as success taken too far. The past is not warning us emotionally. It is instructing structurally. The structure remains intact. Only recognition is required. And recognition, unlike catastrophe, is still optional. Recognition, however, is not a passive act. It is disruptive. To recognize a limit is to accept that something desired must be relinquished. To recognize a threshold is to admit that momentum itself is dangerous. This is why civilizations resist recognition until the last possible moment. Limits feel like defeat when identity is built on expansion. The ancient catastrophe did not feel like failure to those who initiated it. It felt like resolution, a decisive end to uncertainty, a permanent solution to instability. That framing is what made it possible. Instability is uncomfortable. It demands patience, negotiation, uncertainty, and humility. Destruction feels cleaner. It produces immediate clarity. There is a before and an after. Problems appear solved because they are gone. But destruction does not solve instability. It removes the environment in which stability can exist. The ancient survivors learned this lesson not intellectually, but bodily. Hunger teaches faster than philosophy. Poisoned land teaches faster than doctrine. Absence teaches faster than argument. That is why the post-catastrophe world reorganized around avoidance rather than control. Control had failed catastrophically. Avoidance had saved lives. This inversion is crucial. Modern civilization is obsessed with control. Predictive systems, optimization, intervention, management. Problems are framed as things to be acted upon rather than conditions to be respected. The ancient lesson suggests the opposite framing. Some conditions must be left alone. Some systems must not be optimized. Some capabilities must remain unused. This is not anti-technology, it is pro-survival. The most misunderstood aspect of restraint is that it appears passive. In reality, restraint is active resistance against momentum. Momentum is seductive because it distributes responsibility. No single decision causes collapse. Each choice feels incremental, reasonable, even necessary. Only in hindsight does the accumulation reveal itself. The ancient catastrophe unfolded this way. No single order caused annihilation. A series of escalations did, each justified by the one before it, each narrowing options further. By the time the final action was taken, alternatives no longer felt viable. Modern systems exhibit the same narrowing dynamic. Dependencies accumulate. Commitments lock in. Costs of reversal rise. At some point, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. This is the most dangerous moment, because continuation becomes compulsory, not chosen. The ancient world crossed this moment unknowingly. The modern world approaches it knowingly. That difference matters, but only if knowledge alters behaviour. The silence that followed the ancient catastrophe was not only ecological, it was political. Power structures collapsed because they were built on environments that no longer existed. Authority that cannot feed its people cannot rule. Legitimacy evaporates when systems fail. This reveals another critical insight. Collapse is not primarily ideological, it is logistical. When material flows stop, beliefs follow. The ancient cities vanished not because people rejected them, but because they could no longer sustain life. Ideology collapsed after infrastructure, not before. Modern civilization reverses this order rhetorically, but not materially. Belief still follows viability. This means that preventing collapse is less about convincing people and more about preserving conditions. Conditions do not respond to persuasion. They respond to thresholds. The ancient catastrophe crossed thresholds in heat, pressure, toxicity, and salinity. Once crossed, no narrative reversed them. The land enforced its new reality. Modern thresholds operate differently but obey the same principle. Climate systems, biospheres, and resource cycles have limits. They do not negotiate with intention. Crossing them changes baseline conditions permanently. This permanence is what most planning frameworks fail to integrate. They assume reversibility, they assume recovery, they assume repair. History suggests that these assumptions are unreliable beyond certain points. The ancient survivors did not repair their world. They adapted to a diminished one. That adaptation succeeded because expectations were reset. Modern civilization resists resetting expectations. It clings to restoration fantasies. This resistance delays necessary adaptation until damage is irreversible. There is also a psychological dimension that must be confronted. The ancient catastrophe destroyed certainty. People no longer believed that the world was predictable or benevolent. This belief shift reduced risk-taking and tempered ambition. The modern world retains a belief in predictability even as uncertainty grows. Models replace trust in limits. Statistics replace fear of thresholds. This creates a false sense of safety. When uncertainty is treated as manageable variance rather than existential possibility, systems drift closer to edges. The ancient catastrophe shattered that illusion brutally. The modern world has not yet had that illusion shattered at planetary scale. That is both an opportunity and a risk. Opportunity because learning without annihilation is possible. Risk because illusions persist longer without decisive correction. The ancient catastrophe also reveals something uncomfortable about moral narratives. It did not spare the virtuous. It did not target the guilty. It did not discriminate meaningfully. Survival correlated with exposure, not righteousness. This challenges deeply held assumptions about control through behaviour. It suggests that ethics alone do not protect against systemic failure. Ethics without structural alignment are insufficient. This does not render ethics meaningless. It contextualizes them. Ethics must operate alongside respect for physical limits. The ancient world learned this when prayers did not restore soil. Modern civilization risks learning it when ideals do not stabilize systems. The question then becomes not whether collapse can be avoided entirely, but whether its scale can be reduced. The ancient survivors achieved this by shrinking, by dispersing, by lowering intensity, by abandoning damaged zones. These strategies contradict modern instincts, but they align with historical survival patterns. No civilization has ever scaled infinitely. Those that endured longest expanded slowly, contracted when necessary, and avoided irreversibility. The ancient catastrophe serves as a data point, not a myth. It demonstrates that some failures are absolute, and absolute failures do not care about narratives. They care about thresholds crossed. The final lesson embedded in that distant silence is stark. Civilization does not end when it loses power. It ends when it loses options. The ancient catastrophe eliminated options permanently. Modern civilization still has options, but options diminish with delay. Recognition must therefore precede necessity. Restraint must precede enforcement. Avoidance must precede exposure. These are not philosophical preferences. They are survival strategies validated by history. The fire that once fell from the sky did not destroy humanity. It taught humanity how easily it could be destroyed. That lesson has not expired. It has only been forgotten. Whether it will be remembered in time depends not on intelligence, belief, or innovation, but on the willingness to stop while stopping is still possible. Forgetting does not happen all at once. It happens quietly, through success. Each generation that grows up without catastrophe assumes stability is normal. Each decade of uninterrupted growth makes restraint feel unnecessary. Over time, caution begins to look like superstition rather than wisdom. This is how inherited lessons dissolve, not through rejection, but through irrelevance. The ancient catastrophe remained powerful in memory because it reshaped daily life. Fields failed, cities emptied, travel routes vanished. The lesson was reinforced every time someone tried to plant a seed and watched it die. Reality repeated the warning constantly. Modern civilization, by contrast, buffers itself from immediate consequence. Damage occurs at the margins, in distant places, or slowly enough to be absorbed without disrupting daily routine. This buffering weakens learning. When consequences are delayed or displaced, cause and effect separate in the human mind. The ancient survivors did not have this luxury. When systems failed, failure was total. That totality forced coherence between knowledge and behaviour. Modern systems fragment consequence across space and time. The result is fragmentation of responsibility. Everyone contributes. No one feels accountable. Action becomes optional until it becomes impossible. This fragmentation is not accidental. It is a structural feature of large interconnected systems, and it is precisely what makes them dangerous. The ancient catastrophe involved centralized power-making, unilateral decisions with global consequences for its region. Modern civilization distributes decision-making across institutions, corporations, and states, but concentrates outcomes at planetary scale. This inversion creates a paradox. Power is diffuse enough to evade accountability, yet concentrated enough to alter fundamental systems. No ancient civilization operated at this scale, which means no ancient restraint framework was designed for it. This does not invalidate ancient lessons. It means they must be translated. The core lesson remains unchanged. Irreversible change does not announce itself clearly. It feels like progress until it does not. The moment when restraint would be most effective is also the moment when it feels least urgent. This is why civilizations rarely choose restraint voluntarily. They wait until pressure forces adaptation. The ancient catastrophe forced adaptation instantly. The modern world may face a slower forcing function, but one no less final. The danger of slow collapse is that it preserves the illusion of control. People adapt incrementally, adjusting expectations downward without confronting systemic failure. This creates resilience at the individual level, but brittleness at the systemic level. Societies survive longer, but systems weaken. By the time collapse becomes visible, response capacity has already eroded. The ancient survivors adapted by simplifying. Modern civilization adapts by compensating. Compensation increases complexity. Complexity increases fragility. This feedback loop is subtle and persistent. It hides collapse behind functionality. This is why warnings often fail. They describe endpoints, but people live in transitions. Transitions feel manageable, endpoints feel hypothetical. The ancient catastrophe eliminated transition. There was no gradual adjustment. One day there were cities, the next day there were none. Modern collapse scenarios often lack this clarity. They unfold as overlapping crises that normalise dysfunction. This normalisation is itself dangerous. When dysfunction becomes baseline, survival strategies replace prevention strategies. People learn to cope rather than to stop. The ancient survivors did not cope with poisoned land. They left it. They recognised permanence. Modern civilization struggles with permanence. It assumes restoration. This assumption drives delay. Delay narrows options. The ancient lesson warns against this logic. Once certain thresholds are crossed, restoration is not available. Only adaptation to loss remains. Understanding this distinction is critical. Adaptation is not recovery. Adaptation accepts loss. Recovery denies it. The ancient world recovered elsewhere by abandoning irrecoverable zones. Modern civilization resists abandonment. It invests in defending everywhere simultaneously. This overextension increases vulnerability. History shows that survival favours selective retreat. Retreat is not failure, it is preservation. The ancient catastrophe reframed retreat as wisdom. Modern narratives still frame it as defeat. This narrative framing shapes policy, investment, and behaviour. As long as retreat is unthinkable, collapse becomes inevitable. Because systems that cannot retreat must eventually break. This applies not only to territory, but to consumption, growth, and complexity. Some processes must slow, some systems must shrink, some ambitions must be relinquished. The ancient survivors accepted this instinctively. They did not debate whether poisoned land could be restored. They tested it, failed, and moved on. Modern civilization debates restoration endlessly while thresholds approach. This debate delays decisive action. The ancient catastrophe demonstrates that decisiveness alone is not wisdom, but it also demonstrates that delay is not safety. Wisdom lies in choosing the right decisiveness at the right moment. That moment is before collapse feels imminent. After that, options vanish. There is a deeper psychological resistance at work. Human identity becomes entwined with systems. It builds. Letting go of those systems feels like erasing selfhood. The ancient survivors lost cities but retained identity. They rebuilt meaning without restoring structure. Modern civilization risks losing identity if structures fail. This dependency amplifies fear of restraint. Restraint feels like self-annihilation rather than adaptation. This fear is understandable, but it is misplaced. Identity that cannot survive contraction is fragile identity. The ancient world discovered this painfully. Its survivors learned to carry meaning in story, law, and memory rather than infrastructure. This portability allowed continuity. Modern identity is deeply embedded in infrastructure. Energy systems, networks, economies, and technologies are not tools alone. They are extensions of self. This makes restraint feel existentially threatening. But collapse threatens far more. The ancient catastrophe stripped identity down to essentials: family, memory, survival. From that base, civilization re-emerged. Modern civilization has not rehearsed such contraction. Its resilience is untested at that scale. This is why the ancient lesson is urgent. Not as fear, but as preparation. Preparation is not hoarding or defence. It is simplification. It is reducing dependence on systems that cannot fail gracefully. It is designing for degradation rather than perfection. It is valuing continuity over optimization. These principles are not ancient relics. They are design imperatives validated by history. The ancient catastrophe proves that civilization survives not by controlling everything, but by losing less. Loss is inevitable. The question is whether loss is chosen or imposed. Chosen loss preserves agency. Imposed loss destroys it. The fire that once fell from the sky imposed loss. The survivors learned to choose loss thereafter. Modern civilization still has that choice, but it must be made before necessity removes it. That is the final uncomfortable inheritance of the ancient catastrophe, not prophecy, not punishment, but a structural truth about survival. Civilizations endure not by reaching their maximum potential, but by staying below their maximum risk. Those that forget this do not disappear immediately, they accelerate. An acceleration feels like success, right until it becomes extinction. Acceleration is seductive because it hides consequence behind momentum. When systems move quickly enough, feedback arrives too late to inform correction. By the time effects are visible, causes are already entrenched. This delay is not merely technical, it is psychological. Humans evolved to respond to immediate threat, not cumulative risk. The ancient catastrophe bypassed this limitation by collapsing cause and effect into a single moment. There was no ambiguity. Survival demanded immediate radical adaptation. Modern civilization rarely encounters such clarity. Instead, it lives inside gradients. Temperatures rise slowly, ecosystems degrade unevenly, institutions weaken incrementally. Each step appears survivable. Each adjustment reinforces the belief that the next will be as well. This is how systems cross irreversible thresholds without triggering decisive response. The ancient world crossed such a threshold once. Afterward, it reorganized around the assumption that thresholds exist. Modern civilization debates whether they do. This debate is not academic. It shapes action. If thresholds are denied, restraint appears unnecessary. If thresholds are acknowledged, restraint becomes urgent. The difficulty lies in proving thresholds before crossing them. The ancient survivors did not have proof. They had aftermath. Their certainty came too late for prevention, but early enough for adaptation. Modern civilization seeks proof in advance, demanding certainty before acting. But certainty arrives only after consequence. This mismatch between required timing and available evidence is the core challenge of restraint. Waiting for proof ensures delay. Acting without proof requires humility. Humility is rare in successful systems. Success breeds confidence. Confidence resists limitation. The ancient catastrophe disrupted confidence permanently. The modern world has not yet experienced such disruption at planetary scale, which means confidence remains intact. This intact confidence fuels narratives of control. Technology will solve this. Innovation will adapt. Markets will adjust. These narratives are not false in principle. They are incomplete. They assume linearity in systems that behave non-linearly. They assume reversibility in systems that are not. They assume substitution where there is dependence. The ancient catastrophe exposed the danger of these assumptions brutally. Salted land did not respond to ingenuity. Poisoned water did not negotiate. Destroyed cities did not rebuild themselves through optimism. Reality asserted itself without regard for belief. Modern systems still obey reality. They simply obscure it. More effectively, the lesson is not that technology is dangerous. It is that scale without restraint is dangerous. The ancient world possessed technologies appropriate to its scale. When power exceeded governance, catastrophe followed. Modern civilization has power far exceeding ancient scale, while governance struggles to match complexity. This imbalance increases systemic risk. The solution is not abandonment of progress. It is alignment of progress with restraint. Alignment requires redefining success. Success measured by growth alone encourages threshold crossing. Success measured by continuity encourages moderation. This shift is cultural, not technical. It cannot be automated. It must be chosen repeatedly. The ancient survivors embedded this choice into ritual, law, and taboo. Modern civilization must embed it into policy, design, and habit. This requires confronting uncomfortable truths, that some innovations should be delayed, that some efficiencies reduce resilience, that some profits externalize irreversible costs, that some ambitions cannot be safely realized. These truths conflict with prevailing incentives, which is why restraint often emerges only after failure. The ancient catastrophe shows what happens when failure arrives at full force. Modern civilization still has the opportunity to encounter failure in fragments rather than totality, but that opportunity narrows with time. The longer systems operate beyond tolerance, the more abrupt correction becomes. Gradual adaptation is only possible before thresholds are crossed. Afterward, adaptation is forced and severe. The ancient survivors adapted to a diminished world. They did not restore what was lost. They built something smaller but sustainable. Modern civilization must decide whether it prefers voluntary reduction or involuntary collapse. This decision is rarely framed explicitly. It emerges from countless smaller choices: what to prioritize, what to protect, what to abandon, what to slow, what to refuse. Each choice seems insignificant. Collectively, they determine trajectory. History does not hinge on single moments alone. It hinges on accumulation. The ancient catastrophe was the endpoint of accumulated decisions. The modern world is in the accumulation phase. Recognizing this is not pessimism, it is situational awareness. The ancient lesson is not a warning shouted across time. It is a quiet instruction. Stay below the threshold. Do not confuse capability with necessity. Do not trade continuity for dominance. Do not mistake speed for wisdom. The survivors of the ancient catastrophe did not articulate these principles philosophically. They lived them because reality demanded it. Modern civilization must articulate them because reality has not yet enforced them. That difference defines the present moment. Whether restraint becomes chosen wisdom or imposed consequence remains undecided, but the structure of the choice is clear. Civilizations that endure do not eliminate risk, they limit it. They accept that some power must remain unused. They understand that survival is not guaranteed by brilliance alone. It is secured by humility practiced before necessity. The ancient catastrophe remains relevant because it demonstrates this truth without abstraction. It shows the cost of learning too late. The only question that remains is timing. Will restraint be chosen while options still exist, or will it arrive after loss has already decided the answer? Restraint, when chosen early, looks like hesitation. When imposed late, it looks like collapse. This distinction is easy to miss because both slow momentum, but their outcomes could not be more different. One preserves structure, the other destroys it and forces rebuilding under harsher conditions. The ancient catastrophe is the clearest historical example of restraint, arriving too late. Every cultural layer that followed exists because something else ended completely. That ending was not gradual. It was decisive enough to permanently alter how societies imagined power, responsibility, and risk. Modern civilization stands in a rarer position. It can see the pattern without having lived the ending. That advantage is fragile. Patterns only matter if they change behaviour. If they are observed but not acted upon, they become background knowledge, interesting, even disturbing, but inert. History is full of such knowledge. Empires did not fall because they lacked warning. They fell because warning conflicted with incentive. The deeper problem is not ignorance, it is alignment. Systems tend to reward behaviours that increase throughput, expansion, and dominance. They rarely reward behaviours that limit scale, slow growth, or preserve margin. Restraint is almost always counter-incentivized until consequences arrive. The ancient world resolved this through trauma. Pain restructured incentive instantly. Survival became the only metric that mattered. Everything else reorganized around it. Modern systems lack that singular forcing event. Instead, they operate through distributed stress. Distributed stress is easier to ignore. It does not demand immediate response. It allows postponement. It creates the illusion of control. This illusion is reinforced by partial success. When small interventions work, confidence increases. When confidence increases, risk tolerance expands. That expansion continues until intervention stops working. The failure point is rarely where attention is focused. It emerges from interactions between systems rather than single causes. This is why collapse often appears sudden even when it is structurally inevitable. The ancient catastrophe followed this logic. Power was deployed to solve a problem perceived as urgent. The solution exceeded the system's capacity to absorb it. Collapse followed immediately. Modern civilization deploys power incrementally, but the cumulative effect may still exceed absorption capacity. The difference is timescale, not structure. Timescale creates complacency. Complacency erodes caution. Caution erodes margins. Margins are what prevent collapse. Once margins disappear, systems appear stable until they are not. The ancient survivors learned this lesson because margins vanished overnight. Modern civilization risks learning it when margins vanish silently. The key variable is not technology, population, or ideology. It is governance of scale. Can power be limited intentionally before it must be limited by consequence? This question has no historical precedent at planetary scale. Every prior civilization that encountered existential risk adapted only after collapse. Survival followed reduction. What makes the present moment unique is not a danger, but opportunity. The opportunity to reduce scale voluntarily, to trade growth for durability, to value persistence over dominance, to accept slower progress in exchange for longer continuity. These choices are unpopular because they challenge identity. Modern civilization defines itself by acceleration. To slow down feels like regression, yet history suggests that regression is preferable to erasure. The ancient world regressed in scale after catastrophe, but it endured. Cities shrank, ambitions narrowed, technologies simplified, life continued. Collapse did not end humanity, but it permanently reduced what was possible. The modern world risks reduction on a far greater scale, not because it is weaker, but because it is more tightly coupled. When tightly coupled systems fail, they fail comprehensively. Decoupling is therefore a form of restraint. Redundancy is a form of humility. Slack is a form of wisdom. These qualities appear inefficient until they are needed. The ancient survivors valued them instinctively. They built slower. They planned conservatively. They avoided thresholds they could not fully understand. Modern civilization must relearn these values consciously, not because the past was superior, but because the past was closer to consequence. The ancient catastrophe collapsed illusion. The modern world still lives inside one. Illusion is comfortable. It allows postponement. It makes restraint feel optional, until it isn't. The danger is not that civilization will end suddenly. The danger is that it will cross points from which only diminished futures remain. These points are not dramatic. They are cumulative. They appear as trade-offs rather than alarms. Growth now versus resilience later. Efficiency now versus redundancy later. Control now versus adaptability later. Each trade-off seems rational in isolation. Collectively, they decide outcome. The ancient catastrophe was a single overwhelming trade-off made under pressure. The modern world faces millions of smaller ones made daily. That makes recognition harder. But it also makes intervention possible at many points. Restraint does not require halting civilization. It requires adjusting trajectory. That adjustment must occur before momentum makes change destabilizing. This is why early restraint is difficult. It demands sacrifice without visible necessity. It requires trusting pattern over proof. It requires acting on precedent rather than experience. The ancient world lacked that option. The modern world still has it. Whether it will use it remains unknown. But the structure of the lesson is settled. Civilizations do not fail because they run out of ideas. They fail because they exceed the limits of the systems that sustain them. Those limits exist regardless of belief. They do not announce themselves clearly. They enforce themselves brutally. The ancient catastrophe enforced limits through annihilation. The modern world can enforce them through choice. The window for that choice is not infinite, but it is not yet closed. History does not repeat events. It repeats decisions under pressure. The decision now is whether restraint will be proactive or reactive. Proactive restraint preserves agency. Reactive restraint arrives after agency is narrowed. The ancient survivors lived with reactive restraint. Their descendants inherited a quieter world, shaped by loss. The modern world must decide whether it wants to inherit continuity or aftermath. That decision is not made once, it is made continuously. And it begins long before collapse announces itself. There is a moment in every long-lived system when survival stops being about expansion and starts being about orientation. That moment is rarely obvious. It does not arrive with sirens or collapse. It arrives quietly as a subtle mismatch between what a system is capable of doing and what it can safely sustain. Most civilizations pass this moment without recognizing it, because nothing appears broken yet. The ancient catastrophe marked that moment unmistakably. The ground burned, cities vanished, land died, orientation was forced. Modern civilization approaches the same threshold without flames, which makes it more dangerous, not less. When destruction is gradual or abstract, it feels negotiable. When it is immediate and total, it commands attention. This difference explains why the past adapted faster than the present often does. Ancient societies did not need convincing. They needed endurance. They did not debate whether restraint was necessary. The environment made the decision for them. Modern societies still debate. They debate because the environment has not yet imposed a final verdict. That delay is deceptive. Delay creates the illusion that conditions are stable, when in reality they are only buffered. Buffers can be consumed. Once they are gone, change accelerates beyond human response time. This is the core misunderstanding. Collapse is not linear. It is threshold-based. Systems absorb stress until they cannot. When the threshold is crossed, change is rapid and irreversible. The ancient catastrophe crossed multiple thresholds simultaneously. Thermal, ecological, social and political systems failed at once. Recovery required abandoning scale. Modern systems are even more interconnected. They rely on continuous energy flow, constant coordination and uninterrupted feedback. Their tolerance for disruption is lower than it appears, yet because failure has not occurred all at once, confidence persists. This confidence is reinforced by technological success. When technology solves problems, it creates expectation that it will continue to do so. This expectation becomes belief. Belief becomes policy. Policy becomes inertia. Inertia is the enemy of restraint. Restraint requires the ability to say no to immediate benefit for long-term survival. Inertia resists that impulse by framing continuation as normal and deviation as risk. The ancient catastrophe shattered inertia violently. Modern civilization must overcome inertia deliberately. This is not a moral challenge, it is a structural one. Systems designed for growth resist deceleration. Institutions optimized for expansion struggle to maintain equilibrium. Economic frameworks reward throughput, not longevity. None of this implies malice. It implies misalignment. The ancient world experienced misalignment between power and environment. The correction was catastrophic. The modern world experiences misalignment between capability and governance. The correction has not yet arrived. That does not mean it will not. The question is whether correction will be imposed externally or chosen internally. External correction looks like collapse. Internal correction looks like restraint. History suggests external correction is more common. That does not make it inevitable. But it does make voluntary restraint historically rare. Rare does not mean impossible. It means difficult. Difficulty increases when the benefits of restraint are invisible and delayed. Ancient survivors saw benefits immediately. Survival itself was the benefit. Modern societies must accept benefits that manifest slowly. Reduced risk, increased resilience, preserved optionality. Optionality is critical. Once certain thresholds are crossed, options disappear. The ancient catastrophe eliminated options permanently in affected regions. No technology restored the land. No narrative reclaimed it. It was simply gone. Modern civilization risks eliminating options on a planetary scale, not all at once, but cumulatively. Each irreversible change reduces future flexibility. Loss of biodiversity reduces ecological resilience. Loss of stable climate patterns reduces agricultural reliability. Loss of trust in institutions reduces collective response capacity. Each loss narrows possible futures. None of these losses announce themselves as endings. They present as manageable challenges. That is why they are dangerous. The ancient catastrophe was unmistakable because it destroyed immediately. Modern risk operates through subtraction. Subtraction is easier to ignore. Until subtraction accumulates into absence. Absence is harder to reverse than destruction. Destroyed. Structures can sometimes be rebuilt. Lost conditions often cannot. This distinction matters. Modern civilization invests heavily in rebuilding capacity. It invests far less in preserving conditions. Preservation feels passive. Rebuilding feels heroic. Narratives favour heroism. Survival often depends on quiet refusal rather than dramatic action. The ancient survivors became quiet. They valued continuity. They feared excess. They encoded restraint into culture because they had witnessed what happens without it. The modern world must encode restraint without that witness. That requires imagination anchored in precedent. It requires treating ancient catastrophe not as distant myth, but as system behaviour under stress. When seen this way, the past is not primitive. It is instructive. It shows what happens when systems exceed tolerance. It shows that consequence does not negotiate. It shows that survival follows reduction, not domination. The challenge now is psychological as much as structural. Modern identity is tied to growth, economic identity, technological identity, cultural identity. To choose restraint feels like choosing less. But restraint does not mean stagnation. It means redirection. Progress measured by durability rather than acceleration. Success measured by continuity rather than scale. Innovation measured by resilience rather than output. These metrics are unfamiliar but not impossible. They require reframing what counts as achievement. The ancient world achieved continuity by necessity. The modern world must choose it intentionally. That choice must occur before disruption becomes decisive. Once thresholds are crossed, choice narrows rapidly. History is not waiting, it is unfolding. The ancient catastrophe still speaks, not through prophecy, but through pattern. It says this: systems collapse not because they are evil or ignorant, but because they exceed what they can sustain. Power multiplies faster than wisdom unless restrained, and restraint, if delayed, will arrive anyway, imposed by consequence rather than chosen by design. The difference between those two outcomes defines whether civilization adapts or diminishes. The choice remains open, but not indefinitely. There is a final misunderstanding that often prevents civilizations from choosing restraint in time. It is the belief that restraint must come all at once, that it requires collapse-level sacrifice, that slowing one system means halting everything else. This belief is false, and it is dangerous. Restraint does not arrive as a single decision. It arrives as pattern interruption, small refusals, delayed accelerations, redesigned incentives. The ancient world did not survive by abolishing ambition overnight. It survived by changing where ambition was allowed to operate. After the catastrophe, ambition shifted inward. Cities focused on stability rather than reach. Rulers measured success by years without disaster rather than territory gained. Technology served continuity, not dominance. These changes were incremental, but their cumulative effect was survival. Modern civilization struggles because its ambition remains externalized. Expansion outward, extraction outward, optimization outward. Externalization hides consequence. When effects are distant, responsibility feels abstract. The ancient catastrophe collapsed distance. Consequence was immediate. There was no abstraction. Modern systems preserve distance artificially. Supply chains stretch across continents. Waste disappears from view. Energy arrives invisibly. Distance protects comfort while accumulating risk. Restraint requires collapsing distance cognitively, not physically. It requires reconnecting action with outcome. When consequences are felt locally, behaviour changes naturally. When consequences are deferred, denial flourishes. The ancient world did not deny consequence because it could not. The modern world can, and often does. This is why data alone does not change behaviour. Information without proximity lacks urgency. Urgency without agency creates anxiety. Anxiety without structure produces paralysis. Restraint must therefore be structured, not emotional, not apocalyptic. Structured restraint embeds limits into systems, so individuals do not need constant vigilance. Ancient societies did this through law, ritual, and taboo. Modern societies must do it through policy, design, and incentive. Waiting for moral awakening is unrealistic. Systems change when rules change. The ancient catastrophe forced new rules brutally. The modern world must write them intentionally. These rules do not need to be perfect. They need to be directional. They need to favour resilience over efficiency, redundancy over optimization, stability over throughput. This feels inefficient until inefficiency becomes survival. The ancient survivors understood this instinctively. Fields were left fallow, cities were smaller, trade was slower, life was harder in some ways, but possible. The V. Modern world fears any reduction because it equates reduction with regression. But regression is not the same as rebalancing. Rebalancing preserves function by reducing stress. Systems that refuse rebalancing eventually rebalance themselves through collapse. That is not philosophy, it is physics. The ancient catastrophe obeyed physics. So will any future one. There is also a temptation to believe that catastrophe teaches best, that without collapse, restraint will never be chosen. History suggests this is often true, but not universally required. There are moments when civilizations adjust without annihilation. They are rare, but they exist. They occur when leadership aligns with long-term reality rather than short-term reward, when cultural narratives shift before systems fail, when limits are reframed as intelligence rather than fear. These moments do not announce themselves loudly. They appear as boring decisions, delayed projects, abandoned expansions, uncelebrated reductions. They do not feel heroic, they feel anticlimactic, which is precisely why they are resisted. The ancient catastrophe was dramatic. It commanded memory. Modern restraint must function without drama. That makes it harder, not easier. Drama mobilizes attention. Restraint requires patience. Patience is undervalued in high-speed systems, yet patience is what allowed ancient survivors to rebuild at all. They waited. They observed. They adapted slowly. Modern systems reward immediacy. This mismatch amplifies risk. The question then becomes not whether humanity understands the ancient lesson, but whether it can operationalize it under modern conditions. Understanding is widespread. Operationalization is rare. That gap is where outcome will be decided. The ancient catastrophe is not a warning about gods or weapons. It is a case study in threshold violation. It shows that once certain limits are crossed, systems reconfigure whether humans consent or not. The modern world must internalize that. Systems do not negotiate, they respond. Responding late is costly. Responding early feels unnecessary. This is the paradox of prevention. Success looks like nothing happened. Failure looks like inevitability. The ancient world could not prevent. It could only respond. The modern world can prevent. But prevention will never feel justified enough until it is too late. This is why memory matters, not memory of fear, memory of pattern. Pattern recognition is the most valuable inheritance from ancient catastrophe. It allows action before disaster feels real. It allows restraint before necessity enforces it. The past does not demand repetition. It offers an alternative. Whether that alternative is chosen depends not on knowledge, but on courage. The courage to slow down. The courage to reduce. The courage to accept less now to preserve more later. These are not heroic virtues. They are survival virtues. The ancient survivors embodied them because they had no choice. The modern world must embody them because it still does. That choice remains, for now. The choice remains, but it does not remain open forever. History shows that restraint has a shelf life. There is a point at which systems become so interdependent, so accelerated and so politically entangled that slowing down threatens immediate collapse. At that point, restraint no longer feels like wisdom. It feels like destruction. And when restraint feels destructive, societies reject it almost automatically. The ancient catastrophe occurred after that point had already been crossed. What followed was not choice, but consequence. The modern world stands earlier on that curve, but not at its beginning. Momentum is already high. Complexity is already dense. Risk is already global. This is why the most dangerous illusion today is the belief that there will always be more time to decide. Ancient societies also believed they had time. Their cities had endured floods, wars, famines, and political upheaval. Each survival reinforced confidence, until one event exceeded the envelope of experience. That is how thresholds work. They remain invisible until crossed. Modern systems exhibit the same behaviour. Stability persists until it doesn't. Change appears gradual until it becomes abrupt. Control feels sufficient until it vanishes. This is not pessimism, it is system behaviour. recognizing that behaviour does not require fear, it requires realism. Realism demands that limits be respected before they are enforced. The ancient catastrophe enforced limits violently. The modern world still has the ability to enforce them structurally. That difference is decisive. Structural restraint does not announce itself as sacrifice. It announces itself as redesign. Systems can be made slower without becoming weaker. They can be made smaller without becoming fragile. They can be made less optimized without becoming inefficient in purpose. The ancient survivors intuitively redesigned their world around survivability rather than performance. Performance had betrayed them. Survivability preserved them. Modern civilization remains performance-oriented. Speed, scale, output. These metrics dominate decision-making. But performance without resilience is short-lived. The ancient cities performed exceptionally well until they didn't. Their collapse was not gradual, it was total. This distinction matters. Gradual decline allows adaptation. Sudden collapse does not. The danger today is not slow decay, it is rapid reconfiguration. When interconnected systems fail simultaneously, recovery becomes exponentially harder. The ancient catastrophe affected regions. A modern equivalent would affect systems upon which all regions depend. The difference in scope amplifies consequence. Yet the lesson remains identical. Avoid crossing thresholds you cannot reverse. Ancient societies learned this by losing everything. Modern society has the opportunity to learn it by paying attention. Attention, however, is fragile. It competes with distraction, with incentive, with comfort. This is why the ancient lesson has not disappeared entirely. It lingers as unease, as anxiety without a clear object, as stories that refuse to feel irrelevant, as ruins that feel heavier than they should. The land itself still teaches. Poisoned valleys do not lie. Collapsed ecosystems do not negotiate. They simply persist. Civilization can ignore them, but it cannot erase them. The ancient catastrophe was not unique because of its cause. It was unique because of its clarity. It showed consequence stripped of ambiguity. The modern world lives in ambiguity. That ambiguity is dangerous. It allows delay. It allows rationalization. It allows momentum to substitute for intention. The final lesson of the ancient catastrophe is not about apocalypse. It is about proportion. Small changes matter before thresholds. Large changes matter only after. After thresholds, control is gone. The most effective restraint happens long before danger feels real. This is counterintuitive. Humans evolved to respond to immediate threats, not abstract futures. Civilization evolved to extend horizons, but instincts lag behind structures. That lag is where risk accumulates. Bridging it requires cultural maturity. Maturity is not innovation, it is discernment. Knowing not only what can be done, but what should be refused. This refusal is the quietest and hardest form of power. It produces no spectacle, no monuments, no dramatic turning points. It produces continuity. Continuity is invisible until it is lost. The ancient survivors did not celebrate continuity. They lived it. They passed it on unconsciously. We live within the world, their restraint preserved. Whether we extend that inheritance or exhaust, it is not predetermined. The ancient catastrophe does not predict the future. It clarifies the stakes. It reminds us that systems obey limits regardless of belief. It shows that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. It requires restraint applied early, consistently, and without drama. That restraint does not need to be perfect. It needs to be real. If there is a final whisper carried forward from the ancient fire, it is this: the world does not collapse because it is cruel. It collapses because it is finite. remembering that finitude before it asserts itself is the difference between adaptation and aftermath. The choice still exists, not loudly, not heroically, quietly, in design decisions, in priorities, in what is deliberately slowed, in what is deliberately left undone. That is where the future is decided, not in prophecy, not in fear, but in restraint chosen while choice remains. And when the ancient catastrophe is finally understood this way, not as myth, not as judgment, but as precedent, it stops being a warning about the past. It becomes a responsibility in the present. That responsibility does not demand panic, it demands memory. And memory, unlike fear, can be sustained. That is how civilizations endure. That is how the fire remains only a memory, not a repetition. There is one more layer to this story that rarely gets told. It sits beneath data, beneath timelines, beneath theories of collapse or restraint. It is the human layer. Ancient catastrophes did not only reshape land and power, they reshaped perception. After the fire, after the poisoned wind, after the silence settled, people did not simply rebuild differently, they saw differently. The sky was no longer neutral, the ground was no longer trustworthy. Silence itself became something to listen to. That shift in perception is the most enduring legacy of all, because perception governs behaviour long before logic does, long before laws are written, before models are built, before policies are debated. People decide what feels safe and what does not, what feels permanent, what feels fragile, what feels forbidden. The ancient world learned at an almost cellular level that permanence is an illusion. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in moments. Fields that had fed generations turned white and dead. Power that felt absolute evaporated instantly. That knowledge changed how humans related to certainty. Certainty became dangerous. Confidence became suspect. Caution became wisdom. This is why ancient cultures often appear conservative, ritual-bound, and resistant to radical change. It was not ignorance, it was memory embedded in behaviour. Modern civilization, by contrast, has trained itself to distrust caution. We label it pessimism, we frame it as obstruction, we associate it with fear rather than foresight. This reversal matters, because when a culture stops respecting caution, it loses its early warning system. The ancient catastrophe did not destroy humanity's intelligence, it sharpened its intuition. Modern systems sharpen intelligence while dulling intuition. We calculate risk but no longer feel it, and when risk is no longer felt, thresholds are crossed quietly. The most dangerous transitions in history did not arrive with panic, they arrived with normalcy. People went to work, trade continued, ceremonies were observed, then the sky changed. This is why the ancient stories emphasize suddenness, not because the event was random, but because perception lagged behind reality. By the time danger was undeniable, choice was gone. That pattern is not ancient, it is structural, and it is repeating wherever systems outrun the human capacity to sense instability. The lesson then is not about predicting catastrophe, it is about restoring perception, relearning how to notice strain before collapse, how to value slowness before failure forces it, how to respect limits before they enforce themselves. This is not a technological challenge, it is a cultural one. Cultures that endure are not those that expand fastest, they are those that notice earliest. They listen to silence, they respect unease, they treat discomfort as information rather than weakness. The ancient world survived because it adapted its behaviour to what it had learned, even when it no longer remembered why. The modern world remembers why, but has not yet adapted its behaviour. That is the open question, not whether collapse is possible. History has answered that. Not whether warnings exist. They are everywhere. But whether perception can be recalibrated before consequence becomes the teacher again. The ancient catastrophe does not ask us to fear the future. It asks us to recognise that the future is shaped long before it arrives, in habits, in priorities, in what we normalise, in what we ignore, and in what we choose, quietly, repeatedly, not to do. That is where history ends, not with fire, not with silence, but with a decision made early enough that nothing dramatic needs to happen at all.